We were first told to stay home for a couple of weeks so we could flatten the curve. Well, did our collective efforts work? We've all become very familiar with capacity limits, stay-at-home orders, temporary school closures, and so on for the past 2 years. What does the data say? What was society's return on investment for collapsing the economy? I was determined to dig into this. Do lockdowns get a pass or a fail? Stay tuned to find out.
On today's episode of Return to Reason, the failure of NPIs.
Today I'm going to walk you through some of the research I found on this topic, including impacts on healthcare, the economy, and society as a whole over the last 2 years. Every action causes a reaction. Every public policy has a consequence. As always, I encourage you to look into all of this yourself. You certainly don't have to agree with me. I am here to simply offer information and an opinion. What you do with that is totally up to you. After all, it is only in individual critical thinking and choice that we can have a flourishing, healthy society. It is widely known that the basis for instituting lockdown measures in early 2020, the likes of which had never been done on a global scale, was based on modeling. These models are computer algorithms based on limited data, a set of assumptions, parameters, and then extrapolated to quantify theories. Modeling itself is not good or evil. It is very common in scientific research, but they need to be given due perspective. George Box, considered one of the brightest of our 20th century statisticians, says, "All models are wrong. Some models are useful." Well, if the models were all wrong, then when should authorities have reassessed and moved on? What did the emergency management plans say? Did we follow it? In January 2022, Johns Hopkins Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health and Study of Business Enterprise released a paper titled "A Literature Review and Meta-Analysis of the Effects of Lockdowns and COVID-19 Mortality." Well, this study scrutinized over 18,000 studies and ultimately landed on 24 that were eligible to be included within the meta-analysis. An analysis of each of the 3 subgroups of studies support the conclusion that lockdowns have had little to no effect on COVID-19 mortality. More specifically, stringency index studies find that lockdowns in Europe and the U.S. only reduced COVID-19 mortality by 0.2% on average. Shelter-in-place orders, like stay-at-home, were also ineffective, only reducing COVID-19 mortality by 2.9% on average. Specific NPI studies also find no broad-based evidence of notable effect on COVID-19 mortality. The 3 authors make this statement, which may be opinion, but is certainly based on their findings. While this meta-analysis concludes that lockdowns have had little to no public health effect, they have imposed enormous economic and social costs where they have been adopted. In consequence, lockdown policies are ill-founded and should be rejected as a pandemic policy instrument. 0.2% effect on mortality is statistically insignificant. And yet, for all Canadians, the weight of lockdowns was very significant. For some, lockdowns gravely affected their way of life, robbed them of careers, education, support services, or even the opportunity to hug their grandchildren. I'll be sharing some specific case studies later in the show. Let's take a look at the healthcare impacts. Experts are beginning to report a huge uptick in things like breast cancer, prostate cancer, and eating disorders. Why? Either because of fear of catching COVID or their doctor being unavailable, thousands of people did not get screened or treated early for these types of health issues. The U.S. Surgeon General's report laid out these American stats. In early 2021, emergency department visits in the United States for suspected suicide attempts were 51% higher for adolescent girls and 4% higher for adolescent boys. Moreover, pandemic-related measures reduced in-person interactions among children and professionals. This made it harder to recognize signs of child abuse, mental health concerns, and other challenges. It doesn't take an accomplished scholar to think forward a bit. In addition to a significant public health issue of declined mental health, backed up surgeries and swelling wait lists for specialists will indeed have devastating costs to the healthcare system, over and above the loss of life attributed to COVID infections. In October of 2020, only 7 months into North America's pandemic response, 3 highly esteemed doctors from Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard looked at all the data collected thus far. Remember, this was less than a year into things. They released a pandemic strategy based on their medical and scientific background called the Great Barrington Declaration. Contrary to the smear campaign that Fauci himself even stooped to participate in, the Great Barrington Declaration was not put forth by a few fringe epidemiologists and did not advocate for letting COVID run rampant and free. Not at all. The Great Barrington Declaration endorsed something called focused protection. You can absolutely look into the details for yourself. But focused protection basically advocates for highly stringent measures to ensure the aged and vulnerable in our population get whatever support they need to live safely in contaminant-reduced environments. Meanwhile, focused protection also recommends the rest of society carry on almost as normal, and that those in public health would prepare adequately for a small surge that may come in waves during respiratory illness seasons. The Great Barrington Declaration may have been the key to saving millions of lives without the use of lockdowns. So, why was it totally ignored and ridiculed? Now, what did lockdowns cost us? If your first reaction is to shrink back in horror and say, how could one possibly put a cost on human life? Think of it like this. We make impact analysis decisions every day for our own lives, and we don't think twice. How fast to drive, what to eat, what activities to participate in. This is the way of the world. There is a cost to every human life. Although impacts are measurable, hear me clearly, life is a precious gift. Spending billions on things that don't work at saving lives takes billions away from spending on measures that would have saved lives. I'm going to go through just a few pieces of evidence that point to what lockdowns cost us Canadians in dollars and cents. In late 2021, the feds heard in a report that there is no doubt there were CERB abuses. That was our Canada Emergency Response Benefit. The committee transcript reads, claims for $2,000 CERB checks were 6 times the number of COVID jobless. Cabinet budgeted the program at $24 billion. Actual payouts were $81.64 billion. Cost overruns have never been explained. Additionally, the Canada Revenue Agency paid millions in unrecoverable COVID wage subsidies to insolvent companies to the tune of $145.9 million, records show. Revenue Minister Diane Lebotilier disclosed the figures in the Commons in an inquiry of ministry in May of this year. Of those 750 companies, over half of them owed back taxes to CRA, but received the wage subsidy payments anyways. What about our GDP, gross domestic product? The GDP is a broad scope measurement of goods and services produced that power the Canadian economy. A report from Simon Fraser Institute states in 2020, Canada experienced about an 11% fall in the second quarter GDP, and the overall GDP fell by 5.1% according to Stats Canada. Close to half of the fall in Canada's GDP could be attributed to lockdown. This would amount to about $89 billion. These numbers are not just numbers. We all will be living with the collateral damage of lockdowns for decades. If we really want to seek justice for those who tragically died from COVID, we should be steadfast in our pursuit for accountability. There are disproportionate consequences of lockdown measures for a lot of different groups in our society. Far worse is that most politicians aren't talking about it. I don't know about you, but I've never been so fired up to seek more truth and knowledge and to do something, whatever it takes, to ensure this doesn't happen in the true North, strong and free, ever again. As the great martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is in itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. My challenge to you then is, after watching today, what will you do with this information?